Why does food taste like something? Why does heartbreak hurt? Why are you, you? We can see every neuron in your brain fire, but we can't explain why any of it feels real. Science calls this the hard problem, and the answer might not be biological, it might be quantum. Welcome to Sleep Entangled, where neuroscience and quantum physics merge into contemplative voyages. Tonight we bridge the gap between the machinery of the brain and the world of quantum mechanics. We're diving into the Orch-OR Theory, a journey into the microscopic tubes within your cells that might be the literal antenna for your soul. Settle in, subscribe to join our journey into the unseen, and let the mystery guide your rest. Chapter 1. The Hard Problem. Why Brains Don't Explain. You. Here's a question that keeps philosophers and neuroscientists awake at night. Why does it feel like something to be you? Right now, as you listen to these words, billions of neurons are firing in your brain. Electrical signals race along axons. Neurotransmitters flood across synapses. We can measure all of it. We can map which regions light up when you think about your childhood home, when you taste chocolate, when you feel sad or joyful or curious. But here's what we can't explain: why any of that neural activity produces the feeling of experience itself. This is what philosopher David Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness in 1995. Not the easy problems, like how the brain processes visual information, or stores memories, or coordinates movement. Those are incredibly complex, yes, but they're solvable through ordinary neuroscience. The hard problem is different. It's the question of qualia, the subjective quality of experience, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the you-ness of being you. Think about it this way. Imagine we build a perfect computer simulation of your brain, every neuron modelled exactly, every synapse firing in precisely the right pattern. According to standard neuroscience, this simulation should be conscious. It's doing everything your brain does. But would it feel like something to be that simulation? Would there be anyone home, experiencing the computation? Or would it be what philosophers call a zombie, functionally identical to a conscious being, but with the lights off inside? You can't answer this question by looking at neurons. You can't measure it with an fMRI scan, and that's deeply strange because consciousness is the most obvious thing in your existence. It's the only thing you know with absolute certainty. You're here, right now, experiencing this moment. Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am." He could doubt everything else, whether the external world exists, whether other people are real, whether he's dreaming, but he couldn't doubt that he was conscious. The very act of doubting proved something was doing the doubting. Yet modern neuroscience treats consciousness almost as an afterthought. The brain is often described as a biological computer, processing inputs and producing outputs. But computers don't experience anything. Your laptop isn't having a subjective experience when it runs calculations, no matter how sophisticated the program. So where does experience come from? Some neuroscientists argue it's just an illusion, that there's no hard problem at all, just complex information processing that tricks us into thinking we're conscious. But this seems absurd. You can be wrong about many things, but you can't be wrong about whether you're experiencing something right now. Pain might not correspond to tissue damage. Your perception of colour might not match objective wavelengths. But the pain hurts, and the red looks red. The experience is real, even if our interpretation is sometimes mistaken. Others suggest consciousness emerges from complexity. get enough neurons connected in the right way, and somehow mysteriously subjective experience appears. But this doesn't really explain anything. It just names the mystery emergence and hopes that's enough. It's like trying to explain life by saying it emerges from chemistry. That's true, but it doesn't tell you how non-living molecules organize into something that reproduces, grows, and evolves. Similarly, saying consciousness emerges from neural complexity doesn't tell you how electrical signals become feelings. And this is where things get interesting, because a small group of physicists and neuroscientists have proposed something radical. What if consciousness doesn't emerge from neural complexity at all? What if it's quantum? What if the feeling of being you, that irreducible subjective awareness, arises from quantum processes happening inside your brain's cells in structures so small that classical physics breaks down and the strange rules of the quantum world take over? This sounds wild. Your brain is hot, wet, chaotic. Exactly the kind of environment where quantum effects should collapse instantly into classical behavior. Quantum mechanics is usually associated with cold, isolated laboratory experiments, not biological tissue. But over the past few decades, evidence has been mounting that quantum effects do occur in living systems. Plants use quantum coherence in photosynthesis. Birds navigate using quantum entanglement in their eyes. Enzymes exploit quantum tunneling to catalyze reactions. So maybe, just maybe, your brain does too. The idea is called Orchestrated Objective Reduction, or Orch-OR for short, proposed by physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff in the 1990s. It's controversial, criticized, and far from proven. But it's one of the few theories that even attempts to bridge the gap between physical processes and subjective experience. Because here's the thing, quantum mechanics is the only place in physics where observation matters, where the act of measurement changes reality, where consciousness-like behavior seems built into the fabric of the universe. In classical physics, things just are. A ball rolls down a hill according to fixed laws, whether you're watching or not. But in quantum mechanics, particles exist in superposition, multiple states at once, until they're observed. Then the wave function collapses, and one outcome becomes real. What does the collapsing? Measurement, observation, interaction with the environment. But dig deeper, and some interpretations suggest consciousness itself plays a role. Not in a mystical sense, but as a fundamental feature of how quantum systems resolve uncertainty. If that's true, if consciousness is somehow tied to quantum wave function collapse, then perhaps the feeling of being you arises from quantum events in your brain. Perhaps every moment of awareness corresponds to countless quantum collapses happening in the microscopic structures of your neurons. This doesn't solve the hard problem completely. It shifts the mystery down to the quantum level, but it does something important. It puts consciousness into the fundamental physics of the universe, rather than treating it as an unexplained byproduct of complexity. And it makes predictions, testable predictions, about where in the brain these quantum processes occur, about how anesthesia works, about the nature of free will and time and memory. Let this question rest gently in your mind. What if your consciousness isn't computed by your brain, but arises from it? What if awareness lives in the quantum foam of space-time itself, and your neurons are simply the instruments through which it plays? Chapter 2. Inside the microtubule, your neuron's hidden architecture. And if consciousness is quantum, where in your brain would it happen? The obvious answer is neurons. You have about 86 billion of them, each connected to thousands of others through synapses. When neuroscientists talk about how the brain works, they focus on these connections, how signals propagate, how patterns emerge, how networks process information. But Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist at the University of Arizona, had a different idea. He thought consciousness might not happen between neurons, in the synapses, but inside them, in structures called microtubules. Microtubules are part of your cell's skeleton, the cytoskeleton. They're hollow tubes, about 25 nanometers in diameter, made of proteins called tubulins, arranged in a lattice pattern. Every cell in your body has them. They give cells their shape, help them divide, transport cargo around the interior. In neurons, they're especially abundant. They run the length of axons and dendrites, maintaining structure and guiding the growth of new connections. At first glance, they seem like scaffolding, important for construction, but not really involved in the neuron's main job of signaling. But Hameroff noticed something intriguing. Microtubules aren't just passive support structures, they're dynamic. They constantly assemble and disassemble. Tubulin proteins can exist in multiple conformational states, slightly different shapes that change the tube's electrical properties, and these conformational changes can propagate along the microtubule like waves. In other words, microtubules can process information, not in the same way neurons do through action potentials and synaptic transmission. This is something subtler, faster, happening at a scale far below what traditional neuroscience usually considers. Each tubulin protein can be in one of several states, and these states can influence neighboring tubulins, creating patterns that ripple through the lattice. Imagine a crowd doing the wave at a stadium. Each person stands and sits in sequence, and the wave travels around the arena. But no individual person is moving around the stadium. They're just changing state. Microtubules work similarly, except the people are tubulin proteins, and instead of standing and sitting, they're shifting between quantum states. This is where things get quantum. Roger Penrose, the renowned physicist who shared the 2020 Nobel Prize for his work on black holes, had been thinking about consciousness for decades. He believed that consciousness couldn't be algorithmic, couldn't be the result of computational processes no matter how complex. His argument was based on Gödel's incompleteness theorems, mathematical proofs showing that any formal system of logic contains true statements that can't be proven within that system. Penrose argued that human mathematicians can recognize these unprovable truths, which means we're doing something non-computational. We're not just running algorithms. If consciousness isn't algorithmic, what is it? Penrose proposed that it must involve quantum processes, specifically a phenomenon he called objective reduction. In most interpretations of quantum mechanics, wave function collapse happens when a quantum system interacts with the environment. Decoherence. But Penrose suggested that collapse might be objective, built into the structure of spacetime itself. He proposed that quantum superpositions create tiny distortions in spacetime geometry. When the superposition reaches a critical threshold, measured by something called gravitational self-energy, it becomes unstable and collapses on its own, without needing external measurement. This collapse, Penrose argued, is a moment of proto-consciousness, not full awareness, but something fundamental in the universe from which consciousness might arise. When Hameroff read Penrose's work in the early 1990s, he immediately thought of microtubules. Here were structures inside neurons that could maintain quantum states, proteins arranged in geometric lattices that could undergo collective quantum vibrations. And they were everywhere in the brain, not just 86 billion neurons, but potentially trillions of microtubules, each containing millions of tubulin proteins. Together, they developed the Orchestrated Objective Reduction theory, Orch-OR. The idea works like this. Tubulin proteins in microtubules exist in quantum superposition, simultaneously in multiple conformational states. These superpositions become entangled across many tubulins, creating a quantum state that spans the entire microtubule, or even multiple microtubules across different neurons. This quantum state persists for a brief period, perhaps 25 milliseconds, matching the timescale of conscious moments, before reaching Penrose's threshold for objective reduction. When it collapses, a specific pattern of tubulin conformations is selected, and this moment of collapse is a conscious event. Not just any information processing, not just computation, but a genuine moment of awareness, arising from the quantum to classical transition. Think of it like an orchestra. Each tubulin protein is an instrument. Alone, it can make sound, but it's not music. When the instruments are orchestrated, playing together in quantum superposition, they create harmony. And when the conductor brings down the baton, when objective reduction occurs, the music becomes real, the superposition collapses, and you experience that moment of consciousness. This happens constantly. Billions of quantum collapses per second across all the microtubules in your brain, creating the continuous stream of awareness you call your conscious experience. It's a beautiful theory, but is it true? The biggest criticism is that the brain is too hot and too noisy for quantum effects to survive. Quantum coherence, the state where particles are in superposition and can interfere with each other, is incredibly fragile. In laboratory experiments, physicists go to extraordinary lengths to isolate quantum systems, cooling them to near absolute zero, shielding them from vibration and electromagnetic fields, working in vacuum chambers. Your brain is 37 degrees Celsius, filled with water molecules jostling around, ions flowing, electromagnetic fields from neural activity. Conventional wisdom says quantum coherence should collapse in femtoseconds, quadrillionths of a second, far too fast to play any role in consciousness. But as we'll see in the next chapter, nature has surprising ways of protecting quantum states in warm, wet environments. And the evidence that it's happening in your brain is stronger than most skeptics realize. So, picture your neurons not as simple on-off switches, but as vast cities of microtubules, hollow towers arranged in crystalline arrays, vibrating with quantum possibilities, each one a potential stage for the performance of consciousness itself. Chapter 3. Penrose and Hameroff's Quantum Orchestra. Let's dive deeper into how Orch-OR actually works, because the details are where the theory gets fascinating and testable. Roger Penrose's starting point was gravity. Not the gravity you feel pulling you toward Earth, but something far more subtle, the gravitational self-energy of quantum superpositions. In quantum mechanics, a particle in superposition exists in multiple states simultaneously. An electron can spin both up and down. A photon can pass through two slits at once. This isn't metaphorical, as the particle genuinely exists in both states until it's measured. But Penrose pointed out something strange. If a particle is in two places at once, even separated by a tiny distance, its mass is also in two places, and mass warps space-time, creating gravity. So the superposition creates two slightly different space-time geometries, one for each position. These two geometries are themselves in superposition. Space-time is uncertain, blurred, existing in multiple configurations simultaneously. Now, Penrose argued, space-time doesn't like to be in superposition. General relativity describes space-time as a smooth, well-defined geometry. Quantum mechanics says it can be fuzzy and indefinite. At some point, this tension must resolve. When the superposition creates enough gravitational self-energy, when the two geometries differ by a significant amount, the system becomes unstable. It undergoes objective reduction. The wave function collapses spontaneously, without needing any external measurement, and one geometry becomes real. Penrose calculated that this happens when the product of the mass in superposition and the time the superposition lasts reaches a critical threshold related to fundamental constants of nature. For a single electron it would take billions of years. For something the size of a dust grain it happens almost instantly. But for something in between, say, a collection of millions of protein molecules, the threshold could be reached in around 25 milliseconds. 25 milliseconds. That's approximately the duration of a conscious moment. This can't be a coincidence, Penrose thought. What if consciousness is the experience of objective reduction happening in the brain? But where? Neurons are too big and too classical. Individual molecules are too small and collapse too quickly. What structure in the brain could maintain quantum superposition just long enough to reach the Penrose threshold? This is where Hameroff's microtubules enter the picture. A single microtubule contains about 10 million tubulin proteins, arranged in 13 columns forming a hollow tube. Each tubulin dimer, a pair of tubulin proteins, can exist in at least two conformational states, with slightly different shapes and electrical properties. In classical biology, these conformations are like switches, either on or off. But Hameroff proposed that they can exist in quantum superposition, both conformations at once. Moreover, the tubulins are connected through networks of pi-electron clouds, delocalized electrons that can tunnel between molecules. This creates the possibility of quantum entanglement, where the state of one tubulin becomes correlated with others across the microtubule. Imagine a lattice of tubulin dimers, each in superposition between two states. As they become entangled, the entire microtubule enters a collective quantum state, a superposition not of individual molecules, but of large-scale patterns across millions of proteins. This is the orchestra in orchestrated objective reduction. The tubulins are instruments, playing their quantum notes in superposition. The microtubule is the concert hall, where these notes resonate and entangle, and Penrose's objective reduction is the conductor, bringing the orchestra to a crescendo and collapsing the quantum state into a specific classical pattern. When this happens, when the threshold is reached and the superposition collapses, Penrose and Hameroff argue that it's a moment of consciousness. The objective reduction event has a subjective quality. It feels like something, not to the individual tubulin proteins, obviously, but to the organism as a whole, to you. It's experienced as a unified conscious moment. The theory goes further. Microtubules aren't isolated. They're connected to other microtubules in the same neuron through microtubule-associated proteins, or MAPs. They're connected to microtubules in other neurons through gap junctions, direct electrical connections between cells that bypass synapses. This means the quantum state doesn't have to be confined to a single microtubule. It can spread across networks of neurons, creating brain-scale quantum coherence, and when it collapses, it does so as a unified event, which might explain the binding problem, the mystery of how your brain integrates information from different senses into a single, coherent experience. You see a red apple. The color is processed in one brain region, the shape in another, the concept apple in a third. Yet you don't experience them separately. You experience one unified perception, a red apple. How? Orch suggests it's because the quantum state underlying all these processes collapses simultaneously, creating a single moment of integrated awareness. The theory also makes predictions about timing. If conscious moments correspond to objective reduction events, they should occur at intervals determined by the Penrose threshold. For the mass involved in brain microtubules, that's around 25 milliseconds, or 40 times per second. Remarkably, this matches observed brain rhythms. The 40 Hz gamma oscillations seen in EEG recordings have long been associated with consciousness and attention. Perhaps they're the signature of quantum collapse events happening in phase across the brain. Critics argue this is all speculation, that there's no evidence for quantum superposition in microtubules, that even if it occurred, it couldn't be relevant to consciousness because it would collapse too quickly. But here's where the evidence gets interesting. In 2014, a team led by Anirban Bandyopadhyay at the National Institute of Material Sciences in Japan actually measured quantum resonances in microtubules. They found that microtubules can sustain coherent vibrations at multiple frequencies, from megahertz to gigahertz, and these vibrations can persist for surprisingly long times. Other research has shown that microtubules are indeed connected by gap junctions across neurons, creating the kind of network Orch-OR requires. And computer simulations suggest that the geometry of microtubules, their hollow tube structure, might actually protect quantum states from environmental decoherence, much like a quantum computing architecture. The theory isn't proven, but it's not pseudoscience either. It makes specific, testable predictions. It's grounded in real physics and biology. And it's one of the few theories that even attempts to explain why consciousness feels like something, rather than just describing the neural correlates of awareness. So as you rest in this knowledge, consider the possibility that right now, inside your neurons, millions of tubulins are vibrating in quantum superposition, that they're entangled with each other, forming a coherent quantum state spanning your entire brain, and that in about 25 milliseconds, that state will collapse, and you'll experience another conscious moment. The quantum orchestra plays on, and you are the music. Chapter 4. Quantum Coherence in Warm Brains and Anesthesia's Secret. The biggest objection to quantum consciousness has always been the same: the brain is too hot. Quantum coherence requires isolation. When a quantum system interacts with its environment, when photons scatter off it, when molecules bump into it, when thermal vibrations shake it, the superposition decoheres. The quantum state collapses into classical reality. In quantum computing labs, researchers fight decoherence by cooling their systems to millikelvin temperatures, a fraction of a degree above absolute zero. They work in vacuum chambers, magnetically shielded rooms, with error correction protocols to catch and fix decoherence events. Your brain is 37 degrees Celsius, filled with water, bustling with molecular activity. By all rights, quantum coherence should last picoseconds at most, far too short to influence anything at the timescale of neural activity, let alone consciousness. This objection seemed insurmountable for decades, but then, surprisingly, nature proved it wrong. In 2007, a team at Berkeley led by Graham Fleming studied photosynthesis in green sulfur bacteria. When these bacteria absorb light, they transfer energy from light-harvesting antenna molecules to reaction centers where it's converted into chemical energy. Classical physics predicted this should be inefficient, with energy bouncing randomly until it happens to find the right path, but Fleming's team discovered something astonishing. The energy transfer was nearly 100% efficient, and it stayed coherent in quantum superposition for hundreds of femtoseconds even at room temperature. The bacteria were using quantum mechanics to find the optimal path. Instead of the energy taking one route or another, it took all possible routes simultaneously, interfered with itself like a wave, and automatically selected the most efficient path through quantum coherence. This was warm, wet, noisy biology. And quantum effects weren't just surviving, they were being exploited. Since then, quantum coherence has been found in other biological systems. European robins navigate using quantum entanglement in proteins in their eyes called cryptochromes, where electron spins become entangled and remain coherent long enough to sense Earth's magnetic field. Enzymes use quantum tunneling to speed up chemical reactions, with protons appearing on the other side of energy barriers they shouldn't classically be able to cross. It turns out that biological systems have evolved mechanisms to protect quantum coherence. They use structured environments, protein scaffolds, ordered water molecules, electromagnetic fields, to shield quantum states from destructive interference. They exploit something called environment-assisted quantum transport, where the environment doesn't just cause decoherence, but can actually enhance quantum effects under the right conditions. If evolution stumbled upon quantum mechanics for photosynthesis and navigation, why not for consciousness? The question is no longer whether quantum effects can occur in warm, wet biology. They demonstrably can. The question is whether they occur in the brain, specifically in microtubules, and whether they're relevant to consciousness. And this is where anesthesia provides a crucial clue. Stuart Hameroff's day job, remember, is as an anesthesiologist. He spends his time putting people's consciousness on and off like a light switch. He administers drugs, gases like sevoflurane, or injections like propofol, and within seconds, consciousness vanishes. Your brain is still active, neurons are still firing, blood is still flowing. But you, the experiencing subject, are gone, and when the drug wears off, you return with no memory of the gap. What are these drugs doing? For over a century, anesthesiologists didn't really know. The drugs are chemically diverse. Some are gases, some are liquids, some dissolve in fat, others in water. They don't seem to have a common receptor or target. Yet they all produce unconsciousness at specific concentrations. The traditional explanation was that they somehow disrupt neural signaling. Maybe they affect neurotransmitter receptors, or ion channels, or membrane properties, and indeed, at high concentrations, anesthetics do affect these things. But here's what's strange. At the concentrations actually used in surgery, anesthetics have minimal effects on neural firing rates. Your neurons keep working, the cortex stays active, EEG patterns change but don't stop. What does stop is consciousness. And Hameroff noticed something peculiar about the concentrations at which this happens. There's a law in anesthesiology called the Meyer-Overton correlation, discovered in 1899. It states that the potency of an anesthetic is directly related to its solubility in olive oil, a proxy for how well it dissolves in fatty lipid membranes. This seemed to support the idea that anesthetics work by disrupting membranes. But the correlation is suspiciously precise. Over 4 orders of magnitude, potency tracks lipid solubility almost perfectly. That's unusual for a biological effect, which typically involves complex interactions with many variables. Hameroff proposed an alternative. What if anesthetics don't disrupt membranes generally, but specifically target the hydrophobic pockets inside tubulin proteins in microtubules? Tubulin has small cavities inside its structure, about 1 nanometer across, lined with hydrophobic amino acids. These pockets are exactly the right size to accommodate small anesthetic molecules like xenon or nitrous oxide. When an anesthetic molecule binds to these pockets, Hameroff hypothesized, it prevents the tubulin from undergoing the conformational changes necessary for quantum processing. It literally blocks the quantum vibrations in the microtubule lattice. If consciousness arises from quantum coherence in microtubules, and anesthetics disrupt that coherence, then anesthesia should erase consciousness without necessarily affecting neural signaling, which is exactly what we observe. This makes a testable prediction. If you could block anesthetics from binding to microtubules, anesthesia shouldn't work. In the 1990s, researchers tested this using tiny nematode worms genetically modified to have slightly different tubulin proteins. Normal worms were easily anesthetized, but the mutant worms, whose tubulins couldn't bind anesthetic molecules as effectively, were resistant. They stayed conscious at concentrations that knocked out normal worms. More recently, studies using quantum chemistry simulations have shown that anesthetic molecules binding to tubulin would indeed disrupt the kind of quantum vibrations Orch-OR predicts. The mechanism is elegant. The anesthetic doesn't stop tubulin from functioning classically, it just prevents quantum superposition. There's also intriguing evidence from xenon, one of the most potent anesthetics. Xenon is a noble gas. It doesn't react chemically with anything. It has no receptors, no targets, no way to affect neural signaling through conventional means, yet it produces profound anesthesia. How? The only plausible explanation is that it acts physically, not chemically, and the most likely target is the hydrophobic pockets in tubulin, where it can fit perfectly and disrupt quantum states simply by occupying the space. Critics point out that anesthetics also affect other proteins and receptors. This is true, but those effects occur at different concentrations and don't correlate as precisely with anesthetic potency. The microtubule hypothesis explains the Meyer-Overton correlation better than any other theory. If this is correct, it's remarkable. It means that for over a century, anesthesiologists have been turning off consciousness by disrupting quantum processes in microtubules without knowing it. It also suggests a deeper connection between quantum mechanics and subjective experience. Anesthetics don't destroy the information in your brain. They don't erase memories or stop neural firing. They just prevent quantum coherence in microtubules. And when they do, you cease to exist. The lights go out. There's nobody home. When the drug wears off and quantum coherence resumes, you return. Same brain, same neurons, same memories. But the you that experiences it all was absent, and only quantum processes can explain the gap. Imagine anesthesia not as a chemical shutdown of your brain, but as a quantum interruption, a pause in the orchestra, a silence in the music of consciousness, waiting for the quantum vibrations to resume. Chapter 5. Superposition in your synapses. Microtubules aren't the only place quantum effects might shape consciousness. There's another frontier, the synapse itself. When one neuron communicates with another, it releases neurotransmitter molecules into the synaptic cleft, the tiny gap between cells. These molecules drift across the gap, bind to receptors on the receiving neuron, and trigger changes in electrical activity. This process seems straightforward. Chemical signals, physical diffusion, molecular binding. Nothing quantum about it, but look closer, and the quantum world appears. Neurotransmitter release isn't continuous. It's discrete, happening in packets called quanta. When an electrical signal reaches the end of a neuron, it triggers the fusion of vesicles, tiny spheres filled with neurotransmitter molecules, with the cell membrane. Each vesicle contains about 5,000 molecules, and when it fuses, all of them are released at once. But which vesicles fuse and when appears to be probabilistic. There's randomness in the process, unpredictability at the molecular level. Some researchers have suggested this randomness might be quantum in origin. even more intriguing is what happens after release. Neurotransmitter molecules must cross the synaptic cleft, a distance of about 20 nanometers. In classical physics, this is simple diffusion, molecules bouncing around randomly until they happen to hit a receptor. But at this scale, quantum effects can matter. Molecules aren't just particles, they're also waves, with a de Broglie wavelength that depends on their mass and speed. For a small molecule like dopamine or serotonin moving through the synaptic cleft, this wavelength is tiny but non-zero. Could neurotransmitters exist in superposition, taking multiple paths across the synapse simultaneously? Could they interfere with themselves, like photons in a double-slit experiment? The jury is still out, but some theoretical work suggests yes. If neurotransmitters exhibit wave-like behavior, they might find receptors more efficiently than classical diffusion would predict, similar to how energy transfer in photosynthesis is enhanced by quantum coherence. Then there's the receptor itself. When a neurotransmitter binds, it changes the shape of the receptor protein, opening an ion channel. Ions, charged atoms like sodium, potassium, calcium, flow through, changing the electrical potential of the receiving neuron. But ion channels are incredibly selective. A sodium channel lets sodium through but blocks potassium, even though the two ions are nearly identical in size. A calcium channel is even more selective, allowing only calcium despite competition from other ions present at much higher concentrations. How do they do it? Classical explanations involve the channel's shape and charge distribution, which favor one ion over another. But some researchers, like Matthew Fisher at UC Santa Barbara, have proposed that quantum effects play a role. Fisher's idea focuses on calcium ions. Calcium is crucial for brain function. It triggers neurotransmitter release, activates signaling pathways, regulates gene expression. But it's tightly controlled because too much calcium is toxic. Fisher noticed that calcium ions have no nuclear spin in their most common isotope, calcium-40. This makes them immune to certain kinds of quantum decoherence that affect other ions. They can, in principle, maintain quantum coherence longer. He proposed that calcium ions might become entangled with phosphate groups in molecules like ATP or in proteins. When entangled calcium ions enter neurons, they could influence neural signaling in ways that classical ions couldn't, carrying information not just through their presence, but through their quantum state. This is speculative, and Fisher himself emphasizes it's a hypothesis, not a proven fact. But it's testable. If you could replace calcium-40 with calcium-43, which has nuclear spin, you might disrupt quantum effects while leaving classical chemistry unchanged. Experiments along these lines are ongoing. There's also the question of ion channel gating itself. Channels open and close in response to voltage changes or chemical signals. But the exact moment a channel opens seems probabilistic. It's governed by thermal fluctuations, the random jostling of atoms at body temperature. Or is it? Some models suggest that ion channels might exploit quantum tunneling. A charged particle needs to overcome an energy barrier to pass through the channel's filter. Classically, this requires enough thermal energy to hop over the barrier. Quantum mechanically, the particle can tunnel through, appearing on the other side even without sufficient energy. If ion channels use tunneling, it would explain their incredible speed and selectivity, and it would introduce quantum randomness directly into neural signaling. Now, you might wonder, does any of this really matter for consciousness? Ion channels opening microseconds earlier or later, neurotransmitters diffusing slightly faster. How could that affect the subjective quality of experience? The answer lies in scale and synchrony. Your brain has trillions of synapses all firing constantly. Small quantum effects at individual synapses could add up, creating patterns of neural activity that wouldn't occur in a purely classical brain. More importantly, if quantum processes in synapses couple to quantum states in microtubules, they could influence which microtubules enter superposition, and when those superpositions collapse. The synapse might not generate consciousness directly, but it could modulate it, shape it, provide the inputs that quantum processes in microtubules integrate into conscious experience. Think of it like this. Microtubules are the orchestra, but synapses are the audience. The music doesn't come from the audience, but the audience's reactions, their applause, their silence, their rapt attention, shape how the orchestra plays. There's also a deeper philosophical point. If quantum randomness is built into the brain's fundamental operations in neurotransmitter release, ion channel gating, molecular interactions, then your brain isn't deterministic. It's not a clockwork machine computing outputs from inputs. It's something stranger, a quantum system balancing on the edge between order and chaos, using uncertainty itself as a feature, not a bug. And this brings us to one of the most profound questions in neuroscience and philosophy. If your brain is quantum, what does that mean for free will? Imagine your synapses not as simple on-off switches, but as quantum gates, processing not just signals but probabilities, not just information but possibilities. Chapter 6. Autopilot versus awareness, the bioprogrammes running your life. Here's an uncomfortable truth. Most of what you do, you don't consciously decide. Right now, you're breathing without thinking about it. Your heart is beating, your digestive system is processing food, your immune system is fighting off bacteria. None of this requires your awareness. It's handled by ancient biological programs hardwired into your nervous system over millions of years of evolution. But it goes deeper than that. Much of your behaviour, how you react to threats, how you form social bonds, how you navigate hierarchies, how you choose mates, is also governed by inherited programs. Bioprogrammes. These aren't conscious choices. They're instincts, reflexes, evolved responses that execute automatically when triggered by the right stimulus. And they run beneath your awareness, shaping your life in ways you rarely notice. Evolutionary psychologists call these programs behavioral adaptations. They evolved because they increase survival and reproductive success in ancestral environments. Fear of snakes and spiders. That's a bioprogramme. Attraction to symmetrical faces. Bioprogramme. The urge to protect your children, even at great personal cost. Bioprogramme. You don't choose to fear the snake. You see it, and before you're consciously aware, your amygdala triggers a cascade. Adrenaline floods your system, your heart rate spikes, you jump back. Only afterward do you think, that was a snake, I should move away. The reaction came first. Consciousness followed, narrating the event as if you made a decision. But you didn't. The bioprogramme did. This happens constantly. You meet someone and instantly feel trust or distrust. Why? You couldn't explain it consciously, but your brain is running ancient programs for detecting allies and threats, reading micro-expressions, voice tones, body language, integrating them into a gut feeling that emerges into consciousness as intuition. You get angry when someone cuts you off in traffic. The anger feels like a conscious response to injustice, but really, it's a bioprogramme for defending status and territory, evolved in a world where letting challenges go unanswered meant losing resources and social standing. These programs are efficient, they're fast, they don't require deliberation or analysis, they just execute. But here's the problem. They evolved for a very different world than the one you live in now. The ancestral environment, the African savanna, small tribes, scarce resources, constant physical threats, is nothing like modern civilization. Yet the bioprogrammes remain. They're etched into your DNA, your brain structure, your neurochemistry, and they're still running, often producing responses that are maladaptive in the modern world. The fear that kept your ancestors alive when encountering predators now manifests as anxiety in a job interview. The aggression that helped males compete for mates now shows up as road rage. The tribal instinct to distrust outsiders now fuels prejudice and conflict. You can't delete these programs, they're too fundamental. But you can become aware of them. And this is where consciousness, specifically quantum consciousness, becomes crucial. Because if consciousness arises from quantum processes in the brain, it operates at a different level than classical neural computation. The bioprogrammes are classical, deterministic patterns of neural firing, synaptic connections strengthened over evolutionary time, neurochemical cascades that execute automatically. But quantum processes in microtubules, those aren't bound by the same determinism. They exist in superposition, collapsing into specific outcomes in ways that aren't entirely predictable. This creates a space, a tiny window, for something beyond the bioprogrammes, a moment where you're not just executing inherited scripts but genuinely choosing. Let's think about how this might work. Imagine you're in a stressful situation. Someone insults you publicly. The bioprogramme kicks in, defend your status, attack back, escalate the conflict. This response is already loading, neural pathways activating, muscles tensing. But in that moment, there's also quantum activity in your microtubules, tubulins in superposition, entangled states spanning your prefrontal cortex. And when those states collapse, when the quantum orchestra resolves into a specific pattern, it influences which neural pathways activate. Maybe the collapse produces a pattern that inhibits the aggression response. Maybe it activates pathways associated with empathy, or humour, or strategic thinking. Maybe it introduces just enough randomness to break the deterministic chain of the bioprogramme, giving you a different option. You pause, you take a breath, you choose not to retaliate. Was this free will? Sort of. It's not libertarian free will, some soul making uncaused choices, but it's not pure determinism either. It's quantum indeterminacy creating space for outcomes that weren't predetermined by your genes or your past experiences. The bioprogrammes are still there, still influencing you. But consciousness, quantum consciousness, can modulate them, sometimes override them, create moments of genuine agency. This fits with introspective experience. Most of the time you're on autopilot. Walking, talking, eating, driving. You do these things without conscious effort. The bioprogrammes handle it. But occasionally you snap into full awareness. You notice yourself reacting automatically and catch it midstream. You feel the anger rising and choose not to act on it. You recognize a habitual pattern and deliberately break it. These moments feel different. They feel like consciousness asserting itself against the machinery. And perhaps that's exactly what they are. Quantum processes in the brain creating alternative possibilities that the classical bioprogrammes wouldn't produce. There's evidence for this from neuroscience. Studies of meditation, mindfulness, and cognitive behavioral therapy all show that conscious awareness can reshape automatic responses. You can't eliminate fear or anger or desire, but you can notice them arising, and in that noticing, create a gap between stimulus and response. What's happening in that gap? Classically, it's just more neural activity, different pathways inhibiting automatic responses. But if there are quantum processes involved, the gap might be something more, a moment where superposition collapses and you genuinely had multiple possible futures until consciousness chose one. The ancient Stoic philosophers taught something similar. You can't control external events or your initial reactions, but you can control your response. Between stimulus and response there's a space, and in that space lies freedom. If they were right, and if quantum mechanics is involved, then consciousness isn't just a passive observer of the bioprogrammes, it's an active participant, a quantum wildcard that can sometimes override the script evolution wrote for you. As you rest in this understanding, notice the autopilot running beneath your awareness. Notice the inherited programs, the urges, the reactions, the patterns. And notice too the moments when consciousness intervenes, when quantum possibility opens a door and you step through into a future that wasn't predetermined. Chapter 7. Free Will, Entanglement and Evidence. The question of free will has haunted philosophy for millennia. Are you truly free to choose your actions, or is everything predetermined by prior causes, your genes, your upbringing, the laws of physics? Classical physics leans toward determinism. If the universe is a vast clockwork with every particle following fixed laws, then given the complete state of the universe at any moment, the future is determined. Your brain is made of particles obeying those laws, therefore your thoughts and choices are predetermined. Quantum mechanics introduces randomness, but that doesn't obviously help. If your choices are random, they're not free. They're just unpredictable. A decision made by a quantum coin flip isn't an expression of will. It's just noise. But what if quantum processes in the brain don't produce pure randomness? What if they produce something more structured? Something that interacts with classical neural processes in a way that creates genuine agency? This is where Penrose's objective reduction becomes crucial. Unlike random quantum collapse due to decoherence, objective reduction happens at a threshold determined by space-time geometry. It's not random. It's self-organized, arising from the quantum state itself. Penrose argues that this gives consciousness a kind of freedom. The quantum state explores many possibilities in superposition, and when it collapses, it selects one based on the geometry of the quantum configuration, which depends on the information encoded in microtubules, shaped by your memories, experiences, and intentions. It's not determined by prior causes, because the collapse involves quantum uncertainty. But it's not random either, because the superposition itself is structured, influenced by your brain's state. This is subtle. It's not libertarian free will, where you're an uncaused cause. But it's not hard determinism either. It's somewhere in between. Quantum agency. You don't create your thoughts out of nothing. But the collapse of quantum states in your brain introduces genuine novelty, outcomes that weren't encoded in the classical state of your neurons. And that novelty is you, your consciousness selecting one possibility from the quantum superposition. Now there's another quantum effect that might be even more important for consciousness. Entanglement. Quantum entanglement is strange. When two particles become entangled, they share a quantum state, even if separated by vast distances. Measuring one particle instantly affects the other, faster than light could travel between them. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance, and thought it proved quantum mechanics was incomplete, but experiments have confirmed it's real. Entanglement is a fundamental feature of quantum systems. If microtubules in your brain can sustain quantum coherence, they can also sustain entanglement. Tubulins in one part of your brain could become entangled with tubulins in another part. Microtubules in different neurons could share quantum states. This would create a kind of quantum unity across your brain. different regions processing different information would be linked not just through neural connections, but through quantum correlations. And this might solve the binding problem. Your brain is modular. Vision happens in the occipital lobe, hearing in the temporal lobe, planning in the prefrontal cortex, language in the left hemisphere. Yet you don't experience these processes separately. You experience them as unified, a single, coherent stream of consciousness. How? Neuroscience doesn't have a good answer. There's no central processor where all information comes together, no Cartesian theatre where the homunculus watches the show. Instead, consciousness seems to emerge from distributed processes, but how they bind into one experience is mysterious. Quantum entanglement offers a solution. If microtubules across different brain regions are entangled, they don't need a central processor. They're already unified at the quantum level. When the entangled state collapses, it collapses simultaneously everywhere, creating a single, integrated moment of consciousness. This predicts something testable. If you disrupt quantum entanglement in the brain, you should disrupt the unity of consciousness. And remarkably, there's evidence this happens. Split brain patients, people who have had their corpus callosum severed, cutting the main connection between brain hemispheres, report strange experiences. Each hemisphere seems to have its own consciousness, its own awareness, unaware of what the other is experiencing. If consciousness were purely classical, just a matter of neural computation, cutting the corpus, callosum shouldn't split consciousness. The computations can still happen in each hemisphere independently. But if consciousness requires quantum entanglement between hemispheres, severing the physical connection would break the entanglement, creating two separate conscious streams. There's also evidence from studies of gamma oscillations, the 40 Hz brain waves associated with consciousness. These oscillations synchronize across distant brain regions when you're paying attention or consciously perceiving something. Synchronization could be explained classically through neural connections, but some researchers have found that gamma synchrony is too precise, too fast, to be mediated by synaptic transmission alone. It's as if different regions know what each other are doing instantaneously. Quantum entanglement would explain this. Entangled microtubules would synchronize not through signal propagation, but through shared quantum states. Now let's address the skeptics, because there are many, and their objections are worth considering. The main criticism is decoherence. Physicist Max Tegmark calculated in 2000 that quantum superposition in microtubules should collapse in 10 to the power of minus 13 seconds, far too fast to influence consciousness. But Tegmark's calculation assumed microtubules were isolated quantum systems in a thermal bath. Subsequent work has shown this is too simplistic. Microtubules have ordered water around them, screening them from thermal noise. They have electromagnetic shielding from the cell membrane. They might use topological quantum states, which are more resistant to decoherence. More importantly, as we've seen, quantum coherence does persist in warm biological systems. Photosynthesis proves it. Bird navigation proves it. The question isn't whether it's possible, but whether it's happening in microtubules specifically, and there's growing evidence it might be. Studies using laser spectroscopy on extracted microtubules have found quantum vibrations at frequencies predicted by Orch-OR. Simulations show that microtubule geometry could protect quantum states. Anesthesia research supports the idea that consciousness depends on microtubule quantum processes. The evidence isn't conclusive. But it's mounting, and it's making the skeptics less certain. Another criticism is philosophical. Even if quantum processes occur in the brain, why would that create consciousness? Why would collapsing a wave function feel like something? This is the hard problem again, just relocated to the quantum level, and Orch-OR doesn't fully solve it. But it does something important. It puts consciousness into fundamental physics. In classical physics, consciousness is an anomaly, something that emerges mysteriously from complexity. In quantum mechanics, observation and measurement are already part of the theory. The universe behaves differently when it's being observed. Maybe that's not metaphorical. Maybe observation is consciousness, and consciousness is observation. If Penrose is right that objective reduction is a fundamental feature of space-time, then consciousness isn't an emergent property of brains. It's a basic aspect of reality, and brains are the structures that organize it, amplify it, make it complex enough to become self-aware. This doesn't prove anything, but it offers a framework where consciousness fits naturally into physics, rather than being an inexplicable addition. Hold these ideas lightly. Quantum processes in the brain, entanglement across neural networks, objective reduction creating moments of awareness, freedom emerging from quantum uncertainty. The evidence is incomplete. The theory is speculative, but it's grounded in real science, addressing real mysteries, making real predictions. And it offers something rare in neuroscience, an explanation not just of what the brain does, but of what it feels like to be you. Chapter 8. What it means if your mind is quantum. Let's step back and ask, if all of this is true, if consciousness arises from quantum processes in microtubules, if your brain is a quantum system hovering between classical determinism and quantum uncertainty, what does that mean? First, it means you're not a computer, not even a very sophisticated one. Computers are deterministic. Given the same input, they produce the same output every time. They're fast, precise, and utterly predictable. If the brain were just a biological computer, as many neuroscientists claim, then you would be predictable too. Your thoughts, your choices, your personality, all computable, all determined by your neural wiring and the inputs you receive. But if you're quantum, you're fundamentally different. Quantum systems aren't deterministic. They exist in superposition, exploring multiple possibilities simultaneously, and collapse into specific outcomes in ways that aren't fully predictable. This doesn't make you random, it makes you creative. Creativity requires exploring possibility space, trying combinations that haven't been tried before, making leaps that don't follow from logical deduction. Classical computation can optimize within known parameters, but it struggles with genuine novelty. Quantum systems, by their nature, explore all possibilities at once, and when they collapse, they can select solutions that wouldn't be reachable through classical search. Maybe that's what inspiration feels like. Not a logical chain of reasoning, but a quantum collapse, where your brain's superposition resolves into an insight that surprises even you. Second, it means time is different for consciousness than it is for the physical world. In classical physics, time flows uniformly. The past is fixed, the future is determined, or at least determined by probabilistic laws. You're stuck in the present, marching forward one moment at a time. But in quantum mechanics, time is weirder. Superpositions exist outside of classical time. Only when the wave function collapses does an event enter the timeline. If consciousness is the experience of objective reduction, then you're not experiencing time flowing. You're experiencing a series of quantum collapses, each one a discrete moment of awareness, with the illusion of flow created by memory linking them together. This fits with some strange facts about temporal perception. Time doesn't feel constant. Sometimes minutes feel like hours. Other times, hours vanish in what seems like minutes. Flow states, where you lose track of time entirely, might be states where quantum processes synchronize differently, creating a subjective experience disconnected from clock time. There's also the mystery of the present moment. Physically, now is arbitrary, a frame of reference in space-time, no more special than here. But experientially, now is everything. It's the only time you ever actually experience. Why? If consciousness is quantum collapse, then now is the moment of collapse. The past is superpositions that have already collapsed. The future is superpositions that haven't collapsed yet. And you, your awareness, exist only in the knife edge of collapse, the eternal now. Third, it means death is more complicated than we usually think. If consciousness were just neural computation, death would be simple. The computation stops. Neurons die, the brain shuts down, the process ends. You cease to exist, just like a computer turned off. But if consciousness is quantum, it's not clear where it goes when the brain dies. Quantum information can't be destroyed. That's a fundamental principle of quantum mechanics. It can be scrambled, spread out, become inaccessible, but it can't vanish. So when your brain dies and microtubules disintegrate, what happens to the quantum information encoded in their states? Penrose speculates that it might not disappear. It might persist in the space-time geometry itself as gravitational information, or it might dissipate into the environment, becoming entangled with the wider quantum state of the universe. This isn't reincarnation or an afterlife in any religious sense, but it suggests that whatever quantum processes constituted your consciousness don't simply cease. They transform, spread, become part of something larger. Whether that means you survive in any meaningful sense is an open question. Probably not if identity requires continuity of experience. But it's less like turning off a computer and more like a wave dissolving back into the ocean. Fourth, and perhaps most profoundly, it means you're connected to the universe at the deepest level. If your consciousness arises from quantum processes and quantum mechanics is the fundamental description of reality, then awareness isn't an accident. It's not a fluke of evolution, a quirk of complex brains. It's woven into the fabric of existence. Every quantum collapse everywhere in the universe might have a proto-conscious quality. Most of them are simple, isolated, lasting infinitesimal fractions of a second. They don't amount to much, but in your brain, they're orchestrated. Billions of them, synchronized, integrated, creating the rich, complex experience you call consciousness. You're not separate from the quantum universe. You're a part of it, a highly organized part, where the universe has become aware of itself. This echoes ancient philosophical traditions. Vedanta's idea that individual consciousness is a manifestation of universal consciousness, Buddhism's notion that the self is empty but connected to all things, panpsychism's claim that mind is everywhere. Orch-OR doesn't prove these ideas, but it brings them into conversation with modern physics in a way that's intellectually rigorous. Finally, it means there's still so much we don't know. Even if quantum consciousness is real, we're at the very beginning of understanding it. We don't know exactly how microtubules orchestrate quantum states. We don't know how objective reduction translates into subjective experience. We don't know if this applies to all animals, or just some, or what level of quantum processing is necessary for consciousness. We don't know what it means for artificial intelligence. Could a machine be conscious if we built quantum processors that mimic microtubules? Or is biological structure necessary? Would uploaded minds running on classical computers be conscious? Or would they be philosophical zombies processing information without experiencing it? These questions are no longer purely philosophical. They're becoming empirical. Scientists are designing experiments to test quantum coherence in living neurons. Engineers are building quantum computers that might shed light on how quantum processes can perform complex information processing. Anesthesiologists are probing how consciousness can be switched off without stopping the brain. The answers will shape not just neuroscience, but our understanding of ourselves. What we are, why we exist, what happens when we die. Whether we're alone in the universe or whether consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, appearing wherever quantum systems become complex enough to orchestrate their own collapse. So as you rest in this final contemplation, let the mystery remain. You are quantum. You are superposition collapsing into awareness. You are the universe observing itself, one moment at a time, in an endless cascade of possibility resolving into experience. And whether that makes you fundamentally free or fundamentally connected, whether it's a miracle or just physics, it's extraordinary either way. And so, as we drift back from the quantum depths of consciousness, we're left with more questions and answers, but perhaps that's as it should be. You're more than your neurons, more than synapses firing and chemicals flowing. If Penrose and Hameroff are right, you are quantum superposition resolving into awareness, moment by moment, in the hollow tubes of microtubules deep inside your brain cells. You are the universe becoming conscious of itself, orchestrated, integrated, irreducibly you. If this journey through quantum consciousness has stirred wonder within you, consider subscribing to Sleep Entangled for more contemplative explorations where science meets mystery. And as you drift into sleep tonight, imagine your microtubules vibrating in quantum harmony, collapsing into dreams, into thoughts, into the extraordinary fact of your existence. This is Sleep Entangled, where quantum physics and consciousness merge into the music of awareness. Rest well in the knowing that you are quite literally made of possibilities.